Let me tell you about a man named Gus Prrenner. Not because he was famous, not because he got rich or ran for office or did anything that would make the evening news. I want to tell you about Gus because of what he understood and what it cost him to prove it. We're going back to Calvert Parish, Louisiana, 1961. If you've never been to that part of the state, picture flat land that goes on longer than seems fair. Sugarcane on one side of the road, soybeans on the other. The air in summer sits on you like a warm, wet blanket you can't take off. The ditches along the field edges are full of things people decided weren't worth fixing anymore. Busted cultivators, seized up engines, a tire rim here, a cast iron wheel weight there. Nobody thought twice about it. Equipment broke. You left it where it fell, or you dragged it to the edge of the property and let the grass grow up through it. That was just the way things worked. Gus Prrenner was 37 years old in 1961. Second-generation farmer, 180 acres inherited from his father. A quiet man who grew corn and asked few questions. The land had a hollow on its western edge, low, root-tangled, too wet most of the year to put a plow into. His father had used it as a burn pit, hauled junk out there and set it on fire when the mood struck him. When Gus took over the land, he stopped burning. He started looking. Now here's what you need to understand about Gus before we go any further. Some people look at a pile of broken parts and see a mess. Gus looked at the same pile and saw a library. He saw information. He saw things that had already proven what they were made of by surviving years of hard use. Things that, with a little attention, still had work left in them. His wife Nadine called it an affliction. She wasn't entirely wrong, but she also wasn't entirely right. The story proper starts in the spring of '61, when Gus's neighbor, a farmer named Earl Trosclair, decided to scrap a John Deere tractor, a 3010 model, maybe 8 years old, with a crankshaft seized up tighter than a fist. Earl had already called the scrap man. Gus asked him to wait. He offered to take the machine off Earl's hands for nothing, just to save Earl the trouble of the phone call. Earl said sure. What did he care? Gus spent 3 weekends on that tractor. He didn't rush it. He broke the machine down piece by piece, the way you'd take apart a clock if you wanted to understand it rather than just fix it. He cleaned every part that was worth cleaning. He set aside what was cracked or worn through, and he kept what still had life in it. And here's the part that most people would have skipped. He tagged everything. Little aluminum tags, hand-stamped with numbers. Each part got a number. Each number got an entry in a composition book, the kind school children used. Black and white marbled cover, 70 pages, wide ruled. He wrote down what the part was, where it came from, what condition it was in, and what machine it would fit. Then he carried it all to an old curing shed on the back end of the property and put it on shelves. That was it. That was the whole idea. Word travels fast at a grain elevator. Farmers stand around waiting for their trucks to unload, and they talk. By midsummer of that year, men across the parish had heard that Gus Prrenner was taking broken equipment. They didn't know exactly why, but they didn't need to. They had machines sitting out in their fields going nowhere. If Gus wanted them, fine. It was easier than calling the scrap man. By 1965, the curing shed held 380 labeled parts. 380 individual items, each one known, each one placed, each one waiting. Nadine told her sister at Easter that year that she had married a sensible man who had apparently decided, somewhere along the way, to stop being one. Gus heard about this and did not argue the point. He just went back out to the shed and started building a second row of shelving. Now I want you to hold that image for a moment. A man in a shed in Louisiana in 1965, hand-stamping aluminum tags by the light of a single bulb, writing in a composition book, putting things carefully on shelves that nobody but him was ever going to use. His neighbors thought he was peculiar at best. His wife thought he was wasting time that could go toward the actual farm. The hollow on the western edge of the property was starting to fill up with the dead hulks of machines. Rusted green and orange, weeds coming up through the engine compartments. A whole graveyard of iron that most people drove past on the county road and shook their heads at. They called it the boneyard. They meant it as an insult. Gus never said a word. He just kept going, kept recording, kept cleaning, kept tagging. While the rest of the parish tossed things out, Gus was building something. Though even he probably couldn't have told you in 1965 exactly what it was going to be. By the time the second row of shelves was full, the hollow held the bones of 17 machines. 1966. The composition book was on its second volume. It looked like stubbornness. It looked like a hobby for a man who didn't know when to quit. But that's not what this story is really about. There are two kinds of people who will tell you that what you're doing is wrong. The first kind genuinely believes it. They look at what you're building and they can't see the shape of it yet, so they assume there is no shape. They're not mean-spirited. They're just working with limited information, the same as most of us. You can forgive that kind without much effort. The second kind knows exactly what you're building, and that's precisely why they want you to stop. Holt Prrenner was the second kind. Holt ran the Case YH dealership out on the highway, the only full-service shop within 40 miles of Calvert Parish. If your equipment broke down in that part of Louisiana in the 1960s and 70s, Holt Prrenner was more or less your only option. He knew that. He'd built his whole operation around that fact. He sold parts at whatever price he set, and if you didn't like it, you could drive 80 miles round trip to the next county and see if they had what you needed. Most of the time they didn't. So you came back to Holt. You paid what he asked. That was the arrangement. Gus Prrenner was not part of that arrangement. Now, to be fair, Gus wasn't selling anything. Not in those early years. He was just collecting, just tagging and shelving and writing in his composition books. But Holt was a man who understood the future better than most people gave him credit for. He could see what those shelves were eventually going to mean. Every part Gus had on a shelf was a part Holt wasn't going to sell. And Holt didn't like that arithmetic one bit. So he started talking, not loudly, not in any way you could pin down and argue with directly. Just the slow, steady drip of a man who knows where people gather and what they're willing to believe. At the grain elevator, at the diner on Route 12, standing next to a truck in a parking lot after church, Holt Prrenner would shake his head and say that it was a shame, really, what was happening out at the Prrenner place. Swamp hazard, he called it. An embarrassment to the parish. He'd say that Gus was running a hustle on hardworking people, taking their good equipment under the pretense of doing them a favor, then turning around and selling the parts at a markup, which was not true. But a lie told softly enough in enough different places starts to feel like something everyone already knew. People laughed about it, not viciously mostly. Just the low chuckle of men who figured they understood the situation. The phrase "the bogman's boneyard" started making the rounds. Half mockery, half landmark. You'd hear farmers giving directions that way. Turn left at the bogman's boneyard. You can't miss it. And they'd grin when they said it. Gus heard every word of it. Small parishes don't keep secrets. He just didn't react, which somehow made people more uncomfortable than if he'd gotten angry. Then in the summer of 1969, a complaint landed on the desk of the parish code office. It was unsigned. The general direction of the nods at the diner pointed toward Holt Prrenner's dealership, but nobody could say for certain. The complaint alleged that the Prrenner property had become an unsanctioned commercial operation, a potential environmental hazard, and an eyesore in violation of property standards. The code officer assigned to the case was a man named Ferris Domingue. Ferris drove out to the property on a Tuesday morning, walked the hollow, walked the shed, checked his forms, and wrote his report. The report said, "No violation found." The shed was a private storage structure on private agricultural land. The equipment in the hollow was not leaking contaminants into any waterway. No commerce was occurring. Everything was in order. Ferris Domingue, it was later said, told someone at the barbershop that the inside of that shed was the most organized thing he had ever inspected in 22 years of code enforcement. He said it like it had genuinely unsettled him. The complaint went nowhere, but the nickname stuck. And Holt Prrenner kept selling parts at $54 a piece. Here's the number I want you to hold on to, because it matters later. In 1977, a new hydraulic pump for a John Deere row crop tractor cost $54 at Holt Prrenner's counter. $54 for one part. On a farm running thin margins in a year when prices were decent, $54 was still $54, and Holt was the only place you could get it. By 1974, Gus's composition books totaled 1,600 entries. He had built a pole barn on the property to handle the overflow. He had started to concentrate specifically on John Deere row crop tractors, because that was what most of the parish ran, and because concentrating meant he could go deeper instead of wider. Could know those machines the way a doctor knows a particular body, every valve and bearing and seal. He had never once advertised. He had never once put up a sign on the road. He'd simply said yes every time a neighbor asked if they could bring something out. The hollow by then held the carcasses of 41 machines, organized by make and decade, not just piled up. Everything with a purpose. Everything known. From the outside, driving past on the county road, it still looked like a graveyard, an affliction, a man who couldn't let go of things that other people had sensibly decided to leave behind. That was 1977. Commodity prices were holding. Farmers were buying equipment. Holt Prrenner moved 18 units that year, 18 new tractors off his lot. He sponsored the parish fair. He shook hands with everybody. Gus Prrenner went home to his shed and started on the 7th composition book. Every force in that community, the money, the reputation, the quiet authority of the man who controlled the parts, was pointed in one direction. And it was pointed away from Gus. But here's what nobody standing at that grain elevator in 1977 could possibly have seen coming. The thing that was going to make Gus Prrenner matter wasn't growing in his shed. It was growing in a bank. And that's when everything changed. There are disasters that arrive like a storm, loud, visible, something you can point to and name, a flood, a fire, a single bad season. Those are the ones people write about because they have a clear before and an after. You can draw a line. And then there are disasters that arrive like a tide going out, slow, quiet, so gradual that by the time you notice the water is gone, you're already standing in mud up to your ankles, and the boats are sitting on dry ground, and there's nothing to do but look around and take stock of what you have left. That second kind is what came to Calvert Parish in 1984. It didn't start there, of course. It started in the big rooms, in Washington, in the offices of agricultural lenders, in commodity trading floors where men in suits made decisions about prices that farmers in Louisiana would have to live with. Cotton dropped, soybeans dropped, land that had been appraised at $2,000 an acre came back at $900. Operating loans that made sense when crop prices were high suddenly didn't make sense at all. And the banks that had been so eager to lend during the good years discovered all at once that they were equally eager to collect. Across the Gulf South, farms that had survived hurricanes and droughts and 2 world wars quietly handed their keys to the bank. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony. A man would sit at a kitchen table with some papers, and he would sign, and then he would walk outside and look at the land his grandfather had broken, and then he would go inside and not talk about it much. The newspapers wrote about interest rates and federal farm policy. What they didn't write about, what they missed entirely, was what happened to the parts business. Think about it for a moment. Nobody was buying new equipment, which meant nobody needed parts for new equipment. Holt Prenner's dealership, which had moved 18 units in 1977, sold 2 in all of 1984. 2. The service bay that had once had 3 mechanics working it was down to 1 by late '84. And by the spring of 1986, Holt closed the service bay entirely, laid off the last mechanic, locked the door. But here's the thing about a farm that doesn't go under, that hangs on by its fingernails through '84 and '85. A farm where the family is still out there every morning trying to make it work. Those farms still had equipment, old equipment mostly. Equipment that had been running for 10, 15, 20 years, held together by maintenance and stubbornness and the particular ingenuity of people who can't afford to quit. And old equipment breaks. It breaks at the worst possible moment, the way it always does. In the middle of a harvest window, with a crop in the field that will not wait. Now, there was nowhere local to turn. The first one through Gus's shed door in the summer of 1985 was a woman named Patrice Fontenot. Patrice farmed with her husband over in the next parish. Soybeans, mostly, some corn. Their 4020 John Deere had been running since 1968. 17 years on that machine. They knew every sound it made, every quirk. Every morning it needed a little extra coaxing. That summer the hydraulic pump gave out, just gave up, the way things do after 17 years of honest work. Patrice called around. She drove to 2 counties. She called a dealer in Baton Rouge who told her the part was discontinued and he could try to source one from a regional warehouse, but it would take 3 weeks and cost $61 plus shipping. Her soybeans would be ready to cut in 10 days. Somebody at the grain elevator, and nobody remembers exactly who, which feels right somehow, told her to drive out to the Prrenner place on the Western Road. Told her about the bogman's boneyard. Told her to just go ask. Patrice drove out. Gus met her at the door of the pole barn. She told him what she needed. The make, the model, the year. He didn't write anything down. He didn't consult a catalog. He turned around, walked directly to a shelf on the eastern wall, reached up without hesitating, and set a hydraulic pump on the workbench in front of her. He asked her $9 for it. Not $61, not $54, $9. Patrice Fontenot stood there for a moment looking at that part, and then she looked at Gus and she said, and this is what she told people for years afterward. She said, "How long have you had this?" And Gus said, "Since 1971. Came off a machine over in Assumption Parish. Good pump, just needed a home." She paid him $9. She drove home. She put the pump on the tractor. She cut her soybeans inside the window. She saved her harvest. Word does not travel slowly when people are desperate. By the following spring, Gus had supplied parts to 44 farmers across 4 parishes. 44. His ledger for that year shows 160 parts distributed, 160 transactions, and in nearly every one of them, the farmer saved somewhere between 60 and 80% of what that same part would have cost new. In the years when new parts were even available, which they increasingly were not, the manufacturers had been discontinuing components for older models throughout the late 70s and early 80s, quietly removing them from catalogs, assuming nobody would still be running machines that old. Gus had been collecting those exact parts for 24 years, not by accident, not by luck, because he had understood something in 1961 that most people wouldn't understand until 1985. He had understood that the gap between what gets thrown away and what is actually used up is almost always wider than anyone admits. That a thing discarded is not the same as a thing finished. And that somebody, someday, was going to need exactly what everyone else had decided wasn't worth keeping. The reckoning came on a Thursday afternoon in the fall of 1986. Gus was in the pole barn when he heard a truck come up the lane. He didn't look up right away. There were always trucks now. But when he walked to the door, he recognized the vehicle. It was a familiar truck. The decal on the door had been scraped off, but you could still see the ghost of it in the paint. The pale outline of letters. A dealership name. Holt Brammer got out of the truck slowly. He was 62 years old. He looked like a man who had recently had to make peace with a number of things he hadn't planned on making peace with. He walked up to Gus and he stood there for a moment, and then he said he needed a lift arm pin for his personal tractor, a 420. Said the machine had been sitting in his shed and he was trying to get it running again. Gus looked at him for a moment. Then he turned around and went back into the barn. He found the part in under a minute. He carried it back out and set it on the tailgate of Holt's truck and told him $8. Holt paid it. He stood there with the part in his hand, and he seemed to want to say something but wasn't sure what. Finally, he said he supposed Gus had been right all along. Gus shook his head. He said he hadn't been trying to be right. He said he'd never collected to win an argument. He said he collected because discarded things have a second life, and the only question that ever mattered was whether someone was paying attention. Holt got in his truck and drove down the lane without another word. Nobody heard him call it a boneyard again. But that's not the end of the story, not even close. Because what Gus built in a hollow in Louisiana, through 24 years of being laughed at and complained about and ignored, that thing was just beginning to show what it really was. There is a particular kind of person who, when the crisis passes, goes back to the way things were before. The emergency is over, the pressure lifts, old habits return, and whatever lesson the hard years were trying to teach gets quietly filed away and eventually forgotten. Calvert Parish had some of those people. And then there were the ones who had stood in Gus Prrenner's pole barn in the summer of '85 with a broken part in their hand and watched him walk directly to the right shelf without a moment's hesitation. And something in them shifted that did not shift back. By 1987, commodity prices were beginning to stabilize. Not recover exactly, stabilize. The bleeding was slowing. Some of the farms that had survived the hard years were starting to breathe again, cautiously, the way you breathe after a long illness when you're not quite sure the fever is gone for good. New equipment was moving again, slowly. The emergency, by most measures, was easing, and still the trucks came up Gus's lane, not out of desperation anymore. Out of understanding. The farmers who came to Gus in those years, 87, 88, 89, had learned something during the crisis that they couldn't unlearn. They had learned that a used part with a known history is frequently more trustworthy than a new part with none. Think about what that means for a moment. A hydraulic pump that came off a working machine in 1971, that Gus had cleaned and inspected and tagged and stored. That pump had already proven what it was made of. It had run. It had worked. You knew what you were getting. A new part shipped from a warehouse in a cardboard box had no history at all. It might be perfect. It might fail in a week. You had no way of knowing. Gus had always known this. Now the parish knew it too. In the years from 87 through 1990, Gus distributed upward of 220 parts annually, 220 a year. Farmers drove in from parishes he had never visited, some with precise part numbers written on folded pieces of paper, some carrying a broken component in a paper bag hoping for a match, some who could only describe a sound their machine was making and trusted Gus to translate that sound into a part number. He nearly always could. And when a farmer came up that lane without enough cash, Gus didn't turn them away. He accepted crawfish. He accepted a day's labor on his fence line. He accepted a sack of sweet potatoes once, and a half quart of firewood, and on one occasion a border collie puppy that he hadn't asked for but kept anyway, and named Earl, after the neighbor whose tractor had started the whole thing. He carried his entire inventory in his head. 500 parts, 1,000 parts, eventually thousands of parts. Makes, models, years, shelf locations, organized in his memory the way other men carry song lyrics or scripture. Nadine, who had spent 20 years calling it an affliction, stopped using that word sometime around 1988. She didn't announce the change. She just stopped. Now let me tell you about Marlene. Gus's daughter had grown up in that shed. Not as a curiosity, not as a visitor, as a participant. From the time she was old enough to be useful, she had been sorting castings and gasket sets alongside her father, the way other children sorted shells on a beach or baseball cards in a shoebox. She had grown up understanding that every part had a name and a number and a place, and that the system only worked if everyone who touched it respected the system completely. She had Gus's memory, or close to it, and she had something Gus lacked. She could explain things to people in a way that put them at ease, could read what a farmer needed even when he wasn't sure how to ask for it. Marlene joined the operation formally in 1989. She was 26 years old. By 1995, the pole barn held over 2,800 parts. The hollow on the western edge of the property contained 65 equipment carcasses, organized by make and decade. A whole landscape of iron in various states of contribution. Some nearly picked clean, some barely touched. A modest listing in a regional farm directory had begun drawing a new kind of caller. Restorers. Men who were trying to bring a particular machine back to original condition and needed a part that simply did not exist anywhere in the commercial supply chain. Gus would consult his composition books, and more often than not tell them to come on down. A vocational technical program from a school 2 parishes over brought a group of students out one Saturday. Gus spent the whole day with them, teaching them how to strip a tractor without destroying a single part worth keeping, how to think before you reach for a wrench, how to treat a machine like it has a future even when it looks like it only has a past. The instructor told Marlene afterward that it was the best instruction his students had received all year, and he hadn't paid Gus a cent for it. An agricultural museum acquired 2 complete machines from the hollow for permanent display. They sent a truck and a crew. Gus helped them load. He watched the machines go down the lane on a flatbed, and he stood there for a while after the truck was gone. Not sadly, just quietly. The way you watch something leave when you know it's going somewhere it'll be taken care of. Gus Prrenner died in the spring of 2007. He was 83 years old. He had never financed a piece of equipment in his life. He had never purchased a new tractor. He had worked the same 180 acres his father left him, and he had filled the hollow on the western edge with things other people had given up on. And he had kept every one of them in a composition book in his own hand. There were 9 of those books by the time he died. 46 years of entries. The same blunt handwriting throughout. A little slower toward the end, a little more deliberate, but the same hand. Marlene put them in a fireproof lockbox and kept the key on her person. She continued the operation. Of course she did. A feature in the Baton Rouge Advocate in 2010 brought attention from collectors and agricultural historians, and a handful of journalists who drove down from the city and stood in the pole barn with their notebooks and tried to explain what they were looking at. The inventory by then exceeded 5,500 parts. The hollow was famous in the particular way that things become famous when the people who need them finally find them. Nobody called it the boneyard anymore. They called it the parts place. The answer of last resort. You called everyone else first, and when everyone else told you no, you called Marlene. And Marlene said, "Hold on a minute," and went to the shelves and came back with yes. Marlene's son, Theo, joined the operation in 2019. 3rd generation. He grew up the way his mother had grown up. surrounded by the logic of the thing, by the idea that a discarded object is not a finished object, that attention is a form of respect, that the distance between trash and treasure is almost always just a matter of who's paying attention and whether they have the patience to wait for the moment when it matters. The 9 composition books sit in a fireproof lockbox in the office at the back of the pole barn. Theo knows where the key is. He has read every volume. He says his grandfather's handwriting is the clearest thing he has ever tried to read. Not because the letters are fancy, but because every single entry means exactly what it says and nothing more. A part number, a source, a condition, a shelf. No wasted words. No wasted anything. And every week, this is still true, right now, as I'm telling you this. Every week, a farmer drives up that lane. Sometimes they have a part number. Sometimes they have a broken piece in a paper bag. Sometimes they can only describe a sound. They park the truck and they walk up to the barn and they ask for something that nobody else in Louisiana can provide. And the answer is almost always yes. Now, I told you at the beginning that Gus said something to Holt Brammer the day Holt came up that lane with his hat in his hand. I told you Gus said he never collected to win an argument, that he collected because discarded things have a second life. And the only question was whether someone was paying attention. That was the lesson, earned over 46 years, earned through being laughed at and complained about and dismissed by every social force in a 40-mile radius. Earned through 2 decades of a wife who called it an affliction, through a code officer's visit, through the slow, grinding disaster of 1984 that separated the people who had been paying attention from the people who hadn't. Gus didn't state the moral, he just lived it. He lived it and he wrote it down, 9 times over, in 9 composition books, in the same blunt hand, stored now in a fireproof lockbox in a pole barn at the edge of a hollow in Calvert Parish, Louisiana, where the answer is almost always yes.